All right, yeah, thanks Brian, and thanks everyone for having me here. I'm excited to talk about conservation. This is definitely something I'm very, very passionate about, very excited about. I could do this all day, so I'll try to limit it to an hour, whatever we have here. There's no guarantee though. Move some things around on the screen. Let's see. So duplicate this. There we go. Okay, so as Brian mentioned, I'm going to talk a lot about conservation in the Lehigh Valley. But as I was putting this presentation together, I realized several things. Number one, I think it's very valuable to give a much broader background on conservation than just what's happening here in the Lehigh Valley. So let me just stop. I'm sorry, what do you mean to do here, Brian? Stop share? All right. There we go. That's what we wanted. Sorry, Donna. I feel like she's getting the short end of the stick here on this one. Yeah. So the first thing I realized was kind of, again, that conservation is much broader than just what's happening in the Lehigh Valley. To understand what's happening in the Lehigh Valley, I would like to paint a much broader picture of what's happening at the national level, what's happening at the state level, because a lot of those efforts, a lot of that funding, a lot of that stuff funnels down to the Lehigh Valley and in Pennsylvania from the top. Also, probably more importantly, I realized that, you can see here in parentheses, it's not just going to be conservation in Lehigh Valley. It's going to be more focused on the Lehigh River watershed. And that serves two purposes. Number one, it could steal a lot of slides from a previous presentation I gave. And more importantly, number two, is that conservation doesn't really follow arbitrary borders, right? County borders don't really make sense to discuss when we're talking about conservation in this area. And from Wildlands' perspective, yes, we do work in the Lehigh Valley, but our bigger efforts follow hydrological boundaries that actually make sense and matter a little bit more. Something that I feel like gets lost in conservation quite a bit. So it expanded from the original title that was sent out to include some much broader details associated with conservation. At any point, guys, also feel free to stop me and ask questions, comments, whatever you have along the way. What's going on here? There we go. So quick outline. I'm going to just talk briefly about what is conservation. It's a broad term, so I want to kind of narrow it down a little bit for us. Talk about why it's important. Look at some national, state, and local efforts in conservation. Then try to transition into Wildlands Conservancy a little bit more. Talk about land trusts. Talk about where we work and why we work there. Really break down the Conservancy and our efforts and the different departments that we have. And then kind of just touch upon some challenges. I think I'll kind of work in some challenges along the way. But we'll reiterate some of those more specifically, briefly talk about what you folks can do and other folks in the community can do, and then follow it up with some questions at the end. Without further ado, we will jump into the presentation. Conservation is a noun, obviously. Lots of definitions for it as I was looking this up. It's got a meaning in physics in terms of energy transfer and matter transfer. It's got a meaning in art. But we're obviously here today to talk about the last definition that I could find, which I actually really liked, was just conservation is the prevention of wasteful use of a resource, and kind of an add-on to that, the protection of animals, plants, and natural resources. So at its most basic, fundamental level, that's what conservation is. Protecting resources, trying not to be wasteful. And I feel like as we discuss conservation, as the term gets thrown around in conversation, on the news, whatever it might be, it's a really, again, just a really broad term, and there's a lot that goes into conservation, but we all kind of have that same sense that at the end of the day, we're talking about treating our natural resources in a way that makes sense to preserve them, makes sense for humanity, makes sense for just conserving these things, right? So if we really look into the last definition about preserving the natural resources, I found two other definitions. It won't be all text today, guys, trust me, but starting off like this. But conservation, especially in the natural sense, is the care and protection of natural resources, including but not limited to our air, minerals, plants, soils, water, wildlife. It kind of goes on and on and on and on. And that's what we like to focus on. There's so many branches of conservation and so many fields and disciplines of conservation associated with the air, the minerals, the soil, whatever it might be. So I'd like to make sure that those are all known. We're not just talking, again, broadly, but there are specific fields getting into this. And I also like the second definition down here, which talks about the moral philosophy and societal movement focused on protecting species from extinction, maintaining and restoring habitats, enhancing ecosystem services, and protecting biological diversity. So it's not just the act of doing these things, but it's also like a philosophical idea, a moral idea, something that we should be doing, or think we should be doing because it's the right thing to do. And you're certainly seeing that movement in society, I think, more and more as the generations progress here. And really it's a way of passing the nature and these natural resources on to the next generation. So one of my favorite conservationists once said, conservation of natural resources is the fundamental problem. Unless we solve that problem, it would avail us a little to solve all others, meaning that we can't continue to move forward being wasteful, neglecting the environment, whatever it might be. I think that's true. It's just somebody's quote, it's their opinion, but I very much think that's true. And I think the work at Wildlands and other conservation organizations kind of follows along this suit. We need to solve these natural resource problems before we can solve anything else. Why is conservation important? Oops. A lot of pictures here now. There are so many problems in conservation. This isn't all doom and gloom, guys. I do, again, kind of start off that way, but it's not. I could talk about the problems all day long, but there's things like deforestation going on throughout the United States, North America. Obviously, the Amazon we hear about quite a bit. But it could be something like deforestation. It could be something like plastics, plastic waste in our oceans, more specifically. It could be the illegal killing of threatened and endangered species, or any species for that matter, for who knows what reasons. Direct pollution into our waterways. Conservation matters because it starts to look at all these problems that we're seeing on a global scale, not just in the Lehigh Valley, but on a global level. There are problems that conservation seeks to address, and there's many, many more problems than that, but just I think I name a few there. So it becomes important because we need to start to address some of these issues. And I have to mention, kind of one of my favorite topics I don't enjoy global warming, but here we are. It's a good topic to talk about. I think everything in conservation, if you're looking at specific species or plastic waste, whatever it might be, I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest problems we're still dealing with is going to be global warming. And conservation is certainly something that seeks to address the issues with global warming, which include, over the next 80 years here, increased temperatures, 2.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, sea level rise of 1 to 8 feet, extreme weather events like hurricanes and droughts, tornadoes, things like that, fires. We're actually very lucky here in the East that we don't see a whole lot of this stuff directly. We do have increased flooding, which is certainly the worst that we've had, but we don't see a lot of the major hurricanes, although I guess you could say that we had a big nor'easter back around Halloween time. That's very atypical for this time of year. So you are starting to see it, but maybe not as bad as some of these other areas might. Global warming also leads to mass extinctions. We're currently in the middle of what scientists are saying is our 6th mass extinction event, which is directly related to human effects on the environment. More specifically, one of the drivers is global warming. And I think this all kind of gets lost because there's also a huge effect on humans, whether it be our overall health, from people having, say heat strokes, dehydration, whatever it might be. But there's also an increased, disease prevalence, more famine associated with food shortages and droughts, migrations of people, access to clean water, et cetera, that at the end of the day, unless folks start to care a little bit more about conserving things like that, we're going to see these issues deeply affecting not only weather patterns and individual species, but really starting to see a very major effect on the human population. To tie that in, conservation benefits people, right? We are completely dependent upon the environment, and that to me is actually something I used to teach in grad school. We also had a lab on plants, and I used to start the lab by saying, all right, guys and girls, what's the first, what are plants important for? Why do we need them? And I would start writing down lists on the board, like why are plants specifically important? And you could fill up a whole chalkboard in like 2 minutes with why plants are important, right? But really, it's the environment as a whole, and maybe these plants don't exist if the environment kind of falls out of whack. So conservation and the efforts to conserve our natural resources and protect them really does benefit people. Just briefly here, food, water supply, soil conservation, pollinators. Like we wouldn't have food if we weren't thinking about conserving things like water, soil, and pollinators. Clean water and all the rules and regulations associated with water for people's drinking water. Again, we're very lucky here in the East that we have an abundance, but go a little bit farther west and they really have to start thinking about where their water is coming from. Is it clean? Is it drinkable? Do we have a supply, for enough people to be living in these areas? And historically, we never really kind of thought about water and water resources and where they exist, hence why like Las Vegas exists. But I think moving forward, we need to start thinking about conservation and how we can make these resources matter and where people are going to live. Supplies, materials, anything from the wooden floor here to some of the mineral materials that make this laptop and this technology run. You start thinking a little bit more about how beneficial those are to society. Wood, clothing, fuel, you name it. It's all a resource in the ground that we are utilizing, often wastefully, but again, conservation and conserving those things would help out. Medicines and pharmaceuticals. I used to know this number, but an incredible amount of pharmaceuticals and medicines are actually derived from plants and known, or sponges or weird things in the environment like that. And if it's not directly derived from it, it serves as a base. So we wouldn't have all these crazy medicines and these life-saving medicines and pharmaceuticals if not for the chemistry that exists in nature, all these amazing products that already exist out there. And then my personal favorite, why conservation benefits people, is the recreation and aesthetic value of the environment and nature. It promotes health and wellness. It travel and leisure and economic benefits associated with that. I think oftentimes economics and the environment are kind of pinned against one another. And I will always cite statistics to friends and family who kind of disagree with me with stuff like this, that the environment and conservation drives economics in a lot of areas. There was a report that cited, it came out in 2018, that cited that the environmental benefit of conservation in national parks, state parks, outdoor recreation. The outdoor recreation industry is worth $749 billion a year, which is bigger than fossil fuels and you name it, like a bunch of things put together. So there's a huge economic benefit tied to conservation as well. And increase property values. Yep, there's a, you want to give an example how it helped? Oh, yeah. Absolutely. There was a study done by Lehigh Valley Planning Commission that showed if your house exists within a quarter mile of a park or trail, it increases the property value by an average of $25,000, which made me laugh because I had a realtor call me the other day who told me he doesn't like the work that Wildlands does. And I said, well, we benefit you. We increase your property values of the houses you're selling. So anyway, I digress. One of my favorite conservationists as well, aside from Teddy Roosevelt, David Attenborough. I could listen to that man talk all day. I know my voice isn't as soothing as his. But he's quoted as saying, in times of crisis, the natural world is a source of joy and solace. It produces a comfort that can come from nothing else. And I think that is very true. As somebody who's deeply passionate about the outdoors. If I'm stressed, if I need to get away, I'm sure you folks feel the same way, just go outside, take a hike, sit in nature. It is truly, truly a wonderful thing.
I'm sorry, Mike. Do you want to, just want to try, what the heck, do you want to try turning your mic on there? I think with Donna gone.
Okay. Can you hear me? Is that good? Okay. Awesome. Oops. There we go. So again, we're going to work, instead of just the Lehigh Valley, we're going to work from the top down and start with some just federal conservation. Federal conservation is there's so many different avenues to this. We're going to start with just the land and water protections. associated with federal conservation. And as somebody who likes to travel to national parks and hike and camp and stuff like that, I just love this topic here. But at a federal level, we do a really good job of protecting land and water resources. But a lot of avenues, there's some other areas we can talk about tangentially. But the U.S. Department of Interior is a department that houses the National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Bureau of Land Management. Together you're looking at almost 80 million acres of land that the National Park Service owns alone. And that's national parks, that's national historic sites, national monuments, national battlefields like Gettysburg. So most of them are typically focused on conserving water and land for conservation value, but certainly when you get to things like battlefields and maybe more so history context there. Fish and Wildlife Service owns 89.2 million acres of land throughout the United States, focused on wildlife refuges and habitat for these certain animal species and insect species, you name it. And the Bureau of Land Management, which is one that not a lot of people have heard of, but they own quite a bit of land in the West. We'll see in a map here in a second. Almost 250 million acres of land that they own. That's all housed within the Department of Interior. Moving to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that's where your Forest Service sits. They own almost 200 million acres of land, again, mostly in the West, but nonetheless a big owner of land. And finally, U.S. Department of Defense, which we probably don't think about for the conservation value. Historically, these are Army depots and just areas for training facilities and things like that, which is definitely true of the 11.4 million acres that they own. But there's actually quite a significant push from the Army, because they do receive so much funding annually, to start to protect the areas around them for conservation value. I think of, what is that one down? Fort Indiantown Gap is owned by the Department of Defense, and they actually were putting together an effort to protect the Kittatinny Ridge on both sides of their property down there. It serves their purposes, but also has nice conservation value to it. So I like to mention the 11.4 million acres that they own throughout the United States. On the map itself, lots of colors going on here, so just bear with me, but know that anything that is colored here is a different department who owns land. Most of it you can see is out west, right? We're not as fortunate to have a lot of federally owned lands here in the east. There are some areas in Pennsylvania. We have the Allegheny National Forest. You get down into the Shenandoahs and Blue Ridge Parkway and Smokies in the east. Basically, anywhere along the Appalachian Mountains, you have some federal protection. But most of it's in the west. Green is National Forest Service, so anywhere you have the nice wet mountains that actually get the forests, they tend to own them. The National Forest Service does. And then the more arid lands, this big yellow area, I feel very here to point out, that's the Bureau of Land Management. They tend to have, they will have some forested lands, but they tend to be the more arid grasslands, sage lands, things like that. They almost own all of Nevada, which I also think is interesting. And then red, just for references, are Native American reservations. So not so much conservation going on there, but nonetheless, it's a big owner of land in the West. And of course, Alaska down in the corner has quite a bit. All total, the government owns 28% of the lands in the United States. Quite a bit, quite significant. Really exciting number, I think, in my mind. Just federal. Just this U.S. Department of the Interior, Agriculture, and Department of Defense. There was an executive order signed under the Biden administration, with the goal of protecting 30% of U.S. lands, freshwater, and oceans by 2030. I couldn't find a number for oceans. I'm not sure where that stands, but from a land perspective, we're well on the way, and we have been for years. But those movements really didn't start until probably the 1800s or so. And I always like this picture in the story. This is one of the artists, Jack Moran, I think his name was, one of the artists on the original Western expeditions into Yellowstone, where he has painted a picture of Artist Point here in Yellowstone, a nice yellow rock, hence where it got its name, sent these paintings back to Congress, and these paintings were actually utilized to sway Congress into starting to protect land. So I believe Yellowstone, the first national park, was protected in, I want to say 1872 or designated in 1872, and really got the ball rolling from a federal level of protecting land. Yosemite was added shortly thereafter. Teddy Roosevelt's presidency really helped expand that. But there's quite a bit of effort. It's all started with thanks of some folks who really had a vision to see these great resources protected. So thanks to a painting or several paintings, we own 28% of the land in the United States. Oops, I can't see that title. It says a quick tutorial in land preservation. This is something I remember learning. I also was kind of interesting in how land is, in an ideal world, how we would protect the land with different levels of conservation. So when land is protected, it's not all equal, meaning that some habitat is better than others. You might have a core area of, okay, such and such endangered species live here, we need to protect that. And then the area around it might just be kind of supplementary at that point. But it's also not equal in terms of protection on the land as well. So I mentioned the National Park Service having almost 80 million acres of land. And typically what you see is National Park Service has the most restrictive uses of that property. If they own a national park, there's only a short list of things that you can do on that property, a much bigger list of things you cannot do. You can recreate, passively. You can go hiking and biking and follow the road systems and trails around, but you can't cut down trees. You can't set up camp in a non-designated campsite. You can't, extract mineral resources from it. So these higher conservation areas tend to be your national parks and things like that, and they tend to have the most protections. Conversely, are things like something like the Bureau of Land Management might own. It might just be large tracts of land that are important for protection or water, but really they tend to allow more to happen on these properties. They might allow grazing. They might allow soil movement and excavation. They might allow mineral extraction, things like that. So you tend to have a gradient of protection in terms of highest conservation up on one side, and still valuable, but a lower gradient of conservation below. With your national parks on top, Bureau of Land Management lands on the bottom, national recreation areas. Oftentimes you have reservoirs and things like that, and a lot of human activity in these areas. And then kind of sandwiched in between in terms of the conservation value as well as protection value are your national forests, grasslands, and seashores. Very applicable to the state of Pennsylvania and how we run things as well. State parks, state forests. We have wild areas. You could probably argue that you could put the wild areas, or even from a federal level, roadless areas, highest conservation, where there's minimal impact, most conservation. So really trying to limit that kind of stuff. In an ideal world, we would have a national park. Again, high conservation value in the middle. You would surround it, if you could, with national forest land, national grassland, whatever it might be. And then Bureau of Land Management around that. And that's just to kind of create a buffer around these important resources in the middle. If you have a national park here, housing development, private land, whatever it might be all around it, you tend to lose a lot of that, lose the conservation value, but you're really risking that conservation value. As things change, as the environment changes, as global warming becomes a bigger issue, species and habitats need a buffer. They need room. They need resources to be able to spread and adapt to things. So again, in an ideal world, you're talking best protection, core habitats in the middle, and then kind of waning as you go outward. With less protection as you move out. But we don't live in an ideal world all the time, so we have to kind of make do with what we have. But I think the classic example of this is actually Yellowstone, where you have Yellowstone National Park here, the big dark green square in the middle, actually Grand Teton down below here. The light green all around it, national forest land. Purple is state-owned land, and it's kind of hard to see, but there's some tannish yellow kind of scattered throughout, and that's all Bureau of Land Management. Not as nice as my circles that I drew, but paints a pretty picture of how we're actually able to do this in practice. Again, this is the ideal situation, what federal agencies are seeking to do, what state agencies are seeking to do, what local agencies are seeking to do, but it's not always as easy as that. More often than not, we find ourselves in situations like this, and this is probably more of a local level example, where these green squares represent protected land. And this could be a Wildlands Conservancy nature preserve, that could be a state park for all we know, state game lands, whatever it might be. And what we find, instead of being able to create a buffer around it, the best thing to do in these scenarios is let's just connect them. Let's increase the size of these lands, create some habitat corridors, connect these conserved properties, which is just going to benefit, benefit anything from insects and animals and fish to even people recreating. It's nice if there were trails connecting to all these protected parcels. So what you typically see, instead of a building out, you tend to see a building in, where whatever land becomes available, you protect it in a stepwise function, one parcel, one plot of land at a time, until you're able to connect that habitat and ultimately just fill in the rest of the squares. So it's not always that nice core area with a buffer. Sometimes it's just a matter of being able to connect the dots at that point, as we like to say. Plenty of other federal conservation and other agencies involved, other than just simply land and water protection. We've got the Environmental Protection Agency, which really focuses on policy and enforcement and a lot of science and things like that associated with these environmental regulations. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers does a lot of work with dams and actually my favorite, which are wetlands. They'll be the ones who regulate wetland. I say regulate, it's a loose term. Regulate wetland destruction and oftentimes permitting, and then oftentimes reconstruction, like man-made wetlands, and offsetting some damage and destruction that was done. Natural Resource Conservation Service, they provide a lot of technical assistance in funding farming, environmental best management practices. So like the best way to manage your farm from a conservation perspective and from a monetary perspective, and also provide a lot of educational tools. U.S. Geological Survey, they're responsible for mapping throughout the United States, geology, soils, and one of my other favorite, streams. I'm on their website like once a week in fishing season because they monitor all stream flows and temperatures and things like that. So they are a big conservation factor. Bureau of Reclamation, who helps with energy development and water, specifically in waterways. So like the energy produced from hydroelectric dams, which might not sound like conservation, but as we realize the impact of dams and energy, especially in the West, they've actually gotten very good at starting to look more seriously at their footprint that they're having on the environment and try to find ways to, for example, help salmon get by the dams, start to look at some conservation practices that would benefit the environment. And lastly on this list, probably not lastly overall, but is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And they are very big into science of our oceans and the atmosphere, marine fisheries and things like that. Very good, very solid organization as well. Aside from an organizational standpoint, federal conservation really starts to get into policies, laws, acts, regulations, things like that. So just to quickly rattle off a few, we all probably heard about the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act from the 1970s and the big environmental movement that happened there, which regulate pollutions in the environment, specifically in air and water. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which kind of set the standard for federal government specifically to start thinking more seriously about the impact environmentally. And they actually have to go through a series of steps to say, okay, if we want to put in some kind of federal facility, what's the environmental impact of this going to be? And probably one of the most important pieces of legislation would be the Endangered Species Act, which focuses on the status of individual species. Are they possibly going to go extinct if we don't do something about that? And then has a series of steps down how to address that kind of stuff, mostly focused around habitat protection and things. Very, very important policies. Again, there's a ton more we could go into, but we'll keep moving forward. Federal government has regulations for drinking water, for heavy metals, lead, for waste pollution, for wetlands. They regulate a bunch of things that exist throughout our lives in order to help conservation and make sure that we're not polluting the environment too much. They regulate agriculture, energy, whether that be oil, gas, electricity, wind power, solar power, construction industry, automotive. There's regulated sectors, all in the name of federal conservation. Move forward. And most importantly, we'll touch upon this quite a bit, is going to be funding here. The federal government has two very, very big pots of money every year. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on these because I think they are that important. I'll start with the Farm Bill, even though it's second on the list, because I don't know as much about this one. But they get about federal government releases about $450 million per year for agriculture easements, which are basically ways of protecting farms from development. you can make a lot of arguments that farming isn't maybe the most conservative practice in terms of its impact on the environment, but that's why we have things like the Natural Resource Conservation Service to kind of start to promote those. But a farm's still probably better than, say, a warehouse, as we're also so familiar with. So the Farm Bill really provides a lot of money and some technical assistance to states and to counties and then to individual farmers in order to protect their land from development. More important in my world is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Oh man, this bill, or this fund, it's supposed to be $900 million a year for local, state, and federal conservation projects. Anything from recreation to hiking and biking recreation, to pools and community parks, to land protection, to water, to stream restoration. $900 million a year spread throughout the entire country in order to promote these projects. Great. It comes from a 1% tax on offshore drilling, of all things. So this pot of money gets reappropriated every year, but unfortunately not all of it gets allocated every year. Oftentimes the government, as they like to do, will divert a lot of these funds. Up to 2/3 is pretty typical of these funds will go to balancing the checkbook kind of thing. So it's really unfortunate. But in 2019, there's actually really strong bipartisan support to reappropriate this money, get it going to where it needs to be, and hopefully getting that $100 million out and about to state and local agencies. Yes. Typically it starts from it starts as that pot of money on the federal level. I don't know who runs that, but then they allocate it specifically to the state. So each state will get an appropriate an amount that they deem appropriate based off of size of the state, number of parks and protected land. In Pennsylvania, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources will get that money, and then they will divvy it out from there.
Because when you say somebody diverts it, perhaps to just balance a checkbook on other general budget ideas, I'm wondering who that somebody is. Who's the top level diverter?
Yeah, I don't know. It seems to be just whatever congressmen and women want to. Hey, we're short here. Can we get some money over here? I don't know who controls this fund, and I should look into that. But I'm not sure what the governing agency of the Land and Water Conservation. I'm not sure who that is. I should definitely look into that. But like I said, it does get directed down to the states typically, and then you do have the DCNRs of the world, throughout each state managing those funds from there. So something to look into. So thank you for that question. But a very, very important piece of legislation and a very important pot of money for a lot of the work that goes on throughout the state. I did hear, and I don't know if this is true, I can't verify, but that there's apparently not a municipality in the country that has not had a project come from funding from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So very important piece of legislation. If it's not all of them, it's a lot. And I think that's the moral of the story. Moving down to a state level, here we are in the great state of Pennsylvania. I love maps. I think they're so cool. So I don't know if how many of you have actually seen aerial images of the state of Pennsylvania, but really, really a diverse state in terms of what goes on here. Some really interesting topography, geography, and stuff like that. So we're over here in Lehigh Valley, which is part of what's called the Great Valley, which runs down through Harrisburg, Shippensburg, down into what actually forms the Shenandoah Valley. Got the Piedmont region south of that, Philly and Lancaster, really rich farming country. This is really distinct. This is called the Ridge and Valley province here. We have distinct ridges running in this kind of direction, and then valleys between them. Really, really interesting. Apparently, if you study geography in other countries, you would study Pennsylvania and this land, because that doesn't really happen so distinctly anywhere else. But that butts up to the north of the Allegheny Plateau. See this nice rich forested area up here. And then you just got Western PA, which I honestly don't know a lot about, but you got Pittsburgh and Philadelphia kind of sandwiching in between. But just a really unique geography. And I think that lends itself to a lot of the conservation work that happens in the state, because not all these areas are created equal in terms of their conservation value. Some areas are better suited as rich, diverse, steep mountain habitats. Other areas are better suited for farming because of this topography. So this topography really generates, and the lay of the land of Pennsylvania really generates conservation efforts that happen throughout Pennsylvania. Back to land and water preservation. Again, this is such a big part of what conservation is. It's actually protecting the land and the resources. DCNR, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Those are the owners of our state parks and our state forests. About 2.2 million acres of state forests they own, 300,000 acres of state parks. And they also provide the funding opportunities, as I mentioned, coming down from that Land and Conservation Water Fund. Pennsylvania Game Commission, they own our state game lands, which is 1.5 million acres of state land. Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, not as big of landowners, but they do tend to own a lot of streams, lakes, riparian buffer habitat, which is the vegetation along the streams, wetlands, and hatcheries. Oh, and springs. And I'd like to mention springs because Pennsylvania, one thing I did not mention, we have really rich spring creeks, and the Lehigh Valley is actually famous for our spring creeks. Little Lehigh Creek, Monocacy, Bushkill. If there's any fishermen or fisherwomen in the room here, those are famous streams, and it's because of our geology. It's because we have limestone and produces really cold, clean water all year round. So typically, the Fish and Boat Commission will actually buy up chunks of land where these springs dump into the streams, or where these springs get recharged by rainwater. So an important, albeit a smaller landowner, and an important landowner for the health of our streams. But state agencies own everything from things like Pine Creek Gorge, and this is Tioga and Sproul, Tioga and Sproul State Forest up in north central PA. Anybody's been up there. Ohio Pile State Park out in western PA. This is Spring Creek out near State College. There's one of the fishermen. I love this picture, with the exception of all the invasive species growing along the stream side here. But that's one of those famous spring creeks that Fish and Boat actually owns a lot of the property there. But a lot of land up in the Poconos around some of our cranberry and blueberry bogs, which are really unique habitats for this far south. You typically have cranberry bogs farther north but because we have some glaciated plateaus in the state here, you do have these unique habitats as well. And you even have some national natural landmarks in Clarion County, Cook Forest State Park. If anybody's ever been out there, this is actually old growth hemlock and white pine. It's never been harvested before, and well, I'll touch upon this in a second. But a really, really nice area, really big, awesome trees like you've never seen before. At least in the east, if you've seen sequoia trees, they're nothing compared to that, or redwoods. But as far as the East Coast, these are big, beautiful, pristine trees that the state has helped protect. So the agencies do a great job of protecting resources kind of throughout the state here. In addition to state agencies, there's also land trust owned property. I'll talk more about land trust, but that's what Wildlands Conservancy is. We are considered a land trust, over 135,000 acres. Conservation easements, agriculture easements, together almost 900,000 acres. And just a quick synopsis of conservation and agriculture easements. These are not publicly owned lands like state or federal agencies might be. These are privately owned lands. So you whomever might still own that property, but a qualified organization such as a land trust or state or local government will hold the development rights to those property. And I'll touch upon that more, but just for your understanding, it is 900,000 acres of land that will never be developed. So. And there's also some federal land in the state of Pennsylvania. Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania, about 500,000 acres. The Appalachian Trail runs right through Pennsylvania. They own quite a bit of land on either side of it. Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area along the Delaware, quite a big owning of land from the National Park Service. And then you have various lakes and reservoirs that the Army Corps of Engineers tends to own because there's dams associated with them. And national historic sites like Gettysburg and whatnot that also are some federally protected lands. It's all in the state here. This map is all of the protected land. It's probably outdated by 2 or 3 years, but all the protected land throughout the entire Commonwealth, right? So the dark green areas, those are our state forests. A lot of state forests in that Allegheny Plateau region, right? So I'm saying that the physiography of the state drives where this conservation happens. You've got Allegheny National Forest up here on the plateau. You got Tioga and Sproul, Tioga, all legal state forests running around the Allegheny Plateau as well. You've got the Ridge and Valley province. You can see again, some of these state forests down here, all kind of fall into the topography, the geology, just how our state works. The olive green, if you will, those are our game lands, state game lands. They do to some extent follow what I'm saying with the forest and how Pennsylvania is laid out, but because Pennsylvania State Game Commission is promoting hunting and fishing opportunities, you tend to have them dotted outside of these big forested areas. They'll buy any tract of land they can get people on because they're promoting a little bit more outdoor recreation. But still, they do a great job of stewarding their lands. They do a lot of habitat management projects. So still a really good organization. What else is big on this map? Pink areas, those are those privately owned land trust organizations. And then probably the other big one that I would like to point out, state parks and the turquoise, kind of see some big ones there. But the other thing, all these yellow dots, all these like pale yellows down in Piedmont region, Lancaster, Lebanon, into Lehigh Valley, those are your preserved farmlands. So that's why you have such a high concentration of these pale yellow.
Mostly about out west. Oh, but scared me. No, western of the United States. But just looking at this map, excuse me, when forest fire season arrives, as it always does, who's in charge? I mean, everybody's got a little bit in the thing. Yeah, who fights those? I mean, to me, I have a conspiracy theory about this, and I'm not prone to conspiracy theories, but it always bothers me during that season when there's never enough people in, California to fight the fires, and they're bringing them from Tennessee, and it's just they're constantly shifting people all over the country, and I really do have a concern about that, because what if all of a sudden Tennessee's on fire? And this is where my conspiracy theory comes in. It's like, it could happen. You know what I mean? It's like, enough organization, it could happen that there are various major forest fires in the country. And by terrorists is actually my thought, And so I'm wondering, who runs the show during these horrible seasons where there's so much destruction?
Good question. I know that the United States Forest Service provides a lot of help and administration towards putting out the fires. I know that because, to kind of tie to Pennsylvania, the forester for basically the Pocono region of our state forest, he loses about 2/3 of his staff every year during forest fire season, because DCNR, our state forests, will send their fire-trained staff to the west to help the National Forest Service fight the fires. Beyond that, I assume local fire departments. I assume there are probably some paid companies out there who do these things. I don't know who is fighting those, but it's a big cumulative effort.
I'm sorry. When you think about the California situation, because that's the easiest, I think, to comprehend on such a large scale, I had no idea that there were so many groups. Like when you do the conservatory thing, like with the circle in the center, and that's national or whatever, you broaden it out. With so many hands in the pie, it just seems to me that it's not, for a major catastrophe, it's not well planned out.
And probably not. I can't speak enough to it. But you also throw into the mix private land. Like, who's in charge of that private land there then too? So complicated. I think it's probably a big concerted effort. I'm sure there are members from National Park Service. I know there are members from National Forest Service. I'm sure Bureau of Land Management and your local fire department and private organizations are all helping out. I can't speak enough to it. And I hope that, I think we're probably at the point now where the West no longer has a fire season. It seems more like there's just fire years and non-fire years, because it's just so prolonged, significant droughts they have. But I hope that never comes to the East. It shouldn't. We're pretty wet here, but you never know, right? We could theoretically be resource strapped for those occasions. I know when fires happen, I live by Lehigh Gap. I know when fires happen on the Blue Mountain by my house, which is infrequent, but happens, it's all local fire departments. There's almost nobody else up there. Game Commission might send a representative or two because they own some of the game lands on the mountain there, but it's local firefighters at that point. I hope that, DTR is out.
When there's one there and one there and one here and one here.
I guess we're going to find out, aren't we?
And I hope not. But it's actually upset me more listening to how this is set up than it was before. I always assumed that there's somebody who knows what's going on. And I'm not sure that there is.
And there might be. I don't know. I don't work enough with the fire, especially at that level, to know what that would be. I will tell you this, is that when I was 5-6 years ago, before I was working for Wildlands and I was applying for jobs, I would always go to usajobs.gov and search for government positions. I would say half of them were firefighting positions. So there's definitely a lot of federal government input and effort into fighting the fires out west. I assume that's where most of them come from, but who the overseeing agency of that again is, or person, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'm sorry for the interruption with the microphone. We're trying to pick up the questions on the audio so that for the recordings for when it gets posted online. We don't want the terrorists to miss out on any tips or pointers on how to mess with us. So we want to make sure we get it on audio.
Thanks for your guidance.
I'm sure somebody has.
No, you're the smartest person in the room.
Oh, shoot. One more thing to put on this map before I forget is you don't see a whole lot of protected lands here in the northeast region, as well as the entire western half of the state. And a lot of that has to do with, it's kind of a mix of farm and forest up in those areas. But most of the reason you don't see a whole lot of protected land in there is because there's so much influence from past practices. You have a ton of natural gas exploration up in the northeast, your western PA, and coal, actually coal. And then western PA was your initial oil discoveries in the United States up in Titusville, which is somewhere in this area, and coal as well. So you have a lot of past bad practices. Actually, that might be my next slide. It is. That kind of lend itself to not being able to protect land in some of these areas. Some of those practices include deforestation. I don't know the number, but almost the entirety of Pennsylvania was deforested back in, as we progressed farther west. And let me actually back up a step and just kind of caveat this with, I'm not here to say all this stuff is bad. Yeah, sure, environmentally and from a conservation perspective, nowadays we can kind of sit back and say, what the heck were you guys doing? Why are we cutting down this? But would we be where we are today if we didn't utilize these resources? And Pennsylvania is really, really rich in lumber, in coal, and fuel. We have a ton of natural water, a ton of natural resources. So, it's hindsight. It's easy to say you shouldn't have done this stuff, but I think a really good argument can be made that this was probably necessary, for better or worse, necessary for the United States to get to where we are today. But deforestation on a massive scale, that's why I mentioned that Cook Forest State Park before, because it's very few, it's 1,000 acres. And that's one of the only old growth forests that's never been deforested before. Thankfully, the forests come back, and that's why you see a lot of state forest and protected land. But you also had oil discovery in Titusville. That led to, like I said, the whole western side really not having a whole lot of protections. So you have polluted water from oil and coal practices. You have open pit mines and things like that in that area that pollute the water. Nowadays today, it is that natural gas exploration and the drilling and the fracking, the environmental problems associated with that. So as good as Pennsylvania is with its land protection and its water protection efforts, historically, and even arguably currently, we probably don't have the best track record. Thankfully, we had the insight to kind of push some of these efforts forward, but we're still trying to utilize these natural resources as much as possible throughout the state. Logging still takes place on a lot of state-owned land, but it's not this massive scale where you're stripping an entire mountain. It's now done with in a much more scientifically based practice where instead of taking the best trees and leaving the junk ones for timber value, they actually leave the best trees in a lot of cases and take the junk ones out, which actually benefits a lot of species, promotes new vegetation growth, all kinds of fun things. So even though logging still persists on public lands as well as private lands, it's often done in a much more conservatively based fashion and scientifically proven fashion to say, like, this is the best way to manage your forests. It benefits everyone in those instances. Other organizations and agencies that help with state conservation would be the big one comparable to the EPA would be the Department of Environmental Protection, DEP. They regulate and enforce a lot of our state laws, as well as some of our federal laws, like Clean Water Act, for example, has pollution discharge permits and allotments into streams, and DEP will actually be the one who sets that and regulates that stuff until it's said and done. PA Department of Agriculture, funding, technical assistance, as well as land protection. They're the folks who are going to be allocating the money, that farm bill money, down to county level, and then counties will ultimately protect a lot of those farms. PA Department of Community and Economic Development, kind of sounds like that's not really conservation based, but I will say right now that we have a grant from them to help improve some of our nature preserves and some of the trails and parking things. So kind of a roundabout way of saying they promote recreation, which is such a huge part of conservation, in my opinion. And kind of we touched upon these already, but it's the state level and especially the local level, and I'll talk about that too. You start to get your nonprofit organizations and your groups of citizens, your land trusts, your private foundations who might donate money to this, or coalitions. Watershed coalitions are typically big. Like it might be a nonprofit who's completely devoted to the Lehigh River watershed, let's say. So it's not quite statewide, but it's regional. Audubon, I always like to call them out separately because they have a lot of citizen science and they do that on a state level. And then grassroots organizations, think like Trout Unlimited, Ducks Unlimited, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation is actually a pretty big one in Pennsylvania. They help reintroduce elk, protect land, provide money, volunteers, funding, assistance, you name it. These grassroots organizations are really good at working on more regional levels, helping with land protection and environmental issues throughout the state. Back to that funding opportunities component. I kind of answered some of this already, but from the Land and Water Conservation Fund allocates that money. The federal money gets allocated to DCNR every year and it goes into what's called their C2P program, Community Conservation Partnership Program. And that's about $165 million a year. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. That's been over $165 million since this money has been getting allocated to Pennsylvania. So this is 165 is total federal funding that's come to Pennsylvania through this program. Today, and I'm pretty sure this is more or less true historically, these are the 5 projects that get funded statewide. They focus on community and parks recreation, land acquisitions, building partnerships, and typically there's some kind of like strategic plan associated with that. So like, let's build the D&L trail. Well, who are the partners involved? Let's plan that. So, let's make sure everybody's working together. So that funding would go towards getting all that together. Trails specifically, regional, seen national trails, the Appalachian Trail has gotten some funding for this. And finally, rivers, conservation, riparian buffers. Those are the 5 state priorities. And those are broad. There's obviously a lot more in those, but that's really what they focus on when they start to delineate this federal money through their C2P2 program. Again, there's not, this one I know is true. There's not a municipality in the state of Pennsylvania that has not received some kind of funding for a conservation-based project in the Commonwealth. There's also what's called the Keystone Fund that is delineated through DCNR. It comes from a half percentage real estate transfer tax. So this one is a little bit more taxpayer funded, albeit not seemingly a whole lot, 0.5%, but it does add up to have supplied over $1 billion through the course of its life for different projects, again, related to conservation, whether it be recreation, state parks and forests, and then you kind of get into libraries and historical preservation as well, which I can't speak towards, but really a big pot of money that's been widely available for state agencies, for local municipalities, for nonprofits to tap into in order to fund their projects. Hey, we can serve PA, and that's their logo for the Keystone Fund, one of their logos. From a local perspective, keep bringing it down closer and closer here. You typically just have your county governments involved with any kind of land protection at this point. A lot of county governments just have open space programs where they're looking to fund both parks and more wild lands, more naturalized lands, whether it be through agriculture preservation or these conservation easements that we're going to talk about here shortly. And the county governments also have conservation districts, which shouldn't be in the spot here, but the conservation districts are kind of like your regulatory, local regulatory authority. They focus mostly on construction, if you will. So if you're putting in a Walmart or a highway, or we deal with them a lot when we do dam removal, like let's make sure we're not polluting our streams and polluting the habitat a little bit more, but really focused on erosion and sedimentation into our waterways, because that's such a bad pollutant, especially during construction projects. But that comes from a county level. Municipal governments don't really have much of a regulatory component to them. Any kind, if anything, any kind of protection or conservation that goes on, if any, is going to be parks and open space. And there may be some agriculture and conservation easements being handed out. I live in Lehigh Township. We don't care about the environment. We don't have any kind of protection, and we gave up our parks for I don't even know what anymore. But our neighboring municipality, Moore Township, they've got a great agriculture protection program that they started in the 90s. They've transitioned into conservation easements, which are focused more on forested land and wetlands. They have an environmental action committee, which is more of like a concerned citizens kind of group, just to oversee their projects and make sure nothing's having too big of an environmental impact. So it's really municipality dependent, and that's true in the Lehigh Valley. That's true kind of everywhere. On the local level, though, this is where you will have those grassroots organizations. Again, the watershed coalitions could be a thing. Concerned citizens groups. You have smaller rail to trail groups in these local level communities. So yeah, some of these exist at a state level. Some of them could be much more locally focused as well. I think of the Bushkill Stream Conservancy. I mentioned the Lehigh River because that's multiple counties. Well, the Bushkill only encompasses like 2 or 3 municipalities. It's much finer scale for some of these groups. And they typically don't have, it's typically all volunteer based when you get down to this level. Not a whole lot of funding for these folks, not a whole lot of opportunity, but really motivated, really hardworking people. Every time we work with them, it's always wonderful. In all of these instances, except for maybe the grassroots and the concerned citizens, but from the county government and municipal government perspective, they tend to be recreation focused and really limiting the they're not limiting the conservation value, but there's limited conservation value associated with any kind of land and water preservation that they do. And a lot of that's just because they have limited funding, right? They're more concerned about doing what's right for their citizens, which you could argue is protecting land and open space, but it's going to be more recreationally driven. So you'll see parks like this where, they might have protected 100 acres, but it's 100 acres of sidewalks and mowed lawns and scattered trees and playgrounds, all great things. Don't get me wrong. But what we actually start to see is a transition into, okay, Northampton County, we own 100 acres. Let's start to think about why are we cutting all 100 acres and keeping a mowed lawn? Let's stop cutting some of it and just let it grow. Or let's get some grant funding, let's replant it with native species. And this has kind of been going on because there's just so much, push, local level, state level, federal level, or what it might be, like more concern for pollinators, for habitat, for these kinds of things, realizing that these are valuable resources. And I think this is actually a good step to start to see this on a local level. It has the added benefit of all of a sudden, you don't have to send guys and gals out here 2-3 times a week to cut this grass. So you're saving the county or municipality money as well. So what works well for the county in terms of economics also happens to work out well for conservation and the environment, and creating, something like a meadow is actually a really underrepresented habitat. We have a lot of meadow and wildflowers in Pennsylvania. So it's nice to see that happening at a scale when lands are already protected. So there is a shift there, which is nice. In the Lehigh Valley, all this green area is protected in one form or another. It could be a park. It could be state game lands, which you have a big swath of state game lands. I'm sorry, for those of you, I look at maps all day. For those of you who don't know, Lehigh or Hampton counties. I just assume everybody else knows these things because I get so used to looking at them. But here's your Blue Mountain. See all this green land along there. That's all your state game lands and even some National Park Service property with the Appalachian Trail. Got Truxler Nature Preserve here in the middle. State game lands right there next to it. Northwestern Lehigh County, big agriculture easement area. And then probably the next big area is a lot of parks and protected land up in northeast Northampton County. Those are your Lake Mincies, if you've ever been up there. I think actually some of that is Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. There's just nice forest land up in that region. But most of the green that you're seeing on this is probably small community parks, greenways, boat launches, you name it. So a little bit of everything on that map, but quite a bit of protected land and parkland in the Lehigh Valley, thankfully. Transitioning out of some of these efforts, I could talk so much more detail about what actually goes on. I think it's important to see how that kind of funneling down happens and how these efforts aren't just happening at the federal level, they're happening state, local, and hyper-local levels. One of the biggest components in transitioning into what Wildlands Conservancy does is land trusts. Land trust is now and again, it's a nonprofit organization which owns and manages land, certified 501c3 like you folks here. The primary role of a land trust is land protection through either private ownership, meaning that the land trust owns the land, or through conservation easements. And both of these are what we always like to say in perpetuity, meaning forever. The whole purpose is to limit commercial and residential development. And once you conserve and preserve that land, steward these open spaces, these natural resources, these waterways, and farms, parks, in such a way that you're maintaining the environmental integrity of them. You're not just protecting it and letting it go by the wayside, at least in theory. But you're actually trying to steward these lands as well to make sure that they do have a lot of conservation to them. Land trusts are nationally recognized, and what I mean by that is, number one, they exist nationally. There's land trusts all throughout the United States, and more importantly is that there's legislation associated with conservation easements and nonprofits in general that make them really, there's federal protections to the legislation. So I'll touch upon this in a second here, but if somebody wants to come in and say, hey, I want to put a Walmart on this piece of eased property, well, that federally binding legal document that exists, that is the conservation easement, says, no, you can't do it. And I don't care how much money Walmart spends to try to put that up there, they can't do it because there's law associated with this kind of stuff. Some examples of land trusts you might have heard of. The Nature Conservancy is the big conservation-focused land trust. They're an international land trust. They have a headquarters here where's headquarters? Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They have a branch office up in Long Pond near Pocono Raceway, because there's lots of rich resources up in the Poconos. I'm sure they have some in Western PA somewhere too, but they're a great organization. Natural Lands, they're out of Philadelphia. Western PA Conservancy does a lot of Western PA, as you can imagine. And there's often county-specific ones, like Lancaster Conservancy. They will branch, but they're kind of focused there in the county level. But should be the next slide. Really, these organizations are all mission-driven and geographically focused. For example, Wildlands Conservancy's mission is education, connecting people to nature, protecting our forest and water and natural land resources. Lancaster Conservancies might be protect farmland because they're in a big farming area. But regardless of the mission, they're often tied to a particular geography. Again, as an example, it could be Lancaster County. It could be Wildlands Conservancy, which is Lehigh Valley and Lehigh River Watershed. Very specific geographies in which they work because they are limited in staff and resources and funding and things like that. But also because they tend to know the lay of the land the best. You're getting people in there who know you can only cover so much land in the Lehigh Valley, but you have to know it intimately. You know the problems, you know the players. It tends to be geographically focused for those reasons. They're as nonprofits, heavily reliant upon donations, grants, and volunteers, really dependent upon other folks and other funding sources for efforts. It's conservation at a local level. It's that little square box display that I did before where you're connecting tracts of land. You're not creating this big mecca of national parks and things like that. You're just trying to connect the dots more so than not. And typically that's focused around local species, habitats, and resources. And again, the National Park Service might not know about a bog turtle that exists on the Smith property, but we do. And then we go to the Smiths and say, hey, you've got a really great habitat here. We've got some bog turtles, whatever it might be. We're going to help you try to protect this land and protect this resource if you're interested. So that's where that kind of local level knowledge and that tied to the geography really comes in beneficial. In the United States, there are 1,363 accredited land trusts. I was fascinated by this number. 56 million acres are protected in the lower 48 because of land trusts. Now, that doesn't mean that land trusts own all that land or hold conservation easements on that land. I'll talk about this with wildlands work, but it could mean that they facilitated a purchasing of a property that the National Park Service now owns, that DCNR State Forest now owns. So they are responsible. So there's probably some overlap in some of the numbers you've seen today, but they are responsible, land trusts are responsible for helping to protect over 56 million acres of land in the lower 48, which is double the size of all national parks in the United States, which I think is pretty cool. Why do I throw this on here? Oh, this is a cool one. Anybody ever hear of GIS technology? It's like a mapping software. I use it all the time to make a lot of these maps you're seeing. Jack Dangermond is the founder of that. And, we could talk about Wildlands Conservancy preserves, which sometimes are like little 10-acre parcels, or we could talk about this preserve, which was donated by Jack Dangermond and his wife to the Nature Conservancy. It's 25,000 acres off the coast of California, and just the pictures of it are amazing. So, it might be at a local level. It might seem like trivial little things sometimes, but you can have these really awesome properties, these really awesome habitats, these really awesome species protected. At a 10-acre plot or a 25,000-acre plot, there's quite a bit of diversity associated with these efforts. For anybody who's interested, I'm going to hopefully jump to the internet here. There is a website called, a resource that PALTA throws together, PA Land Trust Association, that they actually will, a bunch of resources, but this one in particular shows you all the locations of the land trusts throughout the Commonwealth. You can see quite a few of them, especially focused around the cities, which is typical as well, because you have a lot of resources in the cities. They tend not to be so much focused on habit. They will protect land, but it'll be more focused on recreation, those areas, and like important cultural things and whatnot. But you could click on some of these. Gives you some information about which land trust it is, or this is what I wanted to show you. There it is. If you search, nope, that's not what we do. Yeah, let me back up one. Search by name. That's what I wanted to do. If you search it by name, you could click on a name of any of the land trusts in Pennsylvania. It'll take you to them, and it'll actually show you, where they're located. Oops, too far. Here's my mouse. And it'll actually show you their geographic extent, which again, I think is really important when you understand land trusts, is that these folks do tend to work in very distinct regions. So there's not too much overlap always, but sometimes you get some of it. It's not loading. So that one actually focuses on the river. So if anybody's interested, PA Land Trust Association will have a ton of resources to learn more about land trusts, but some really good maps. The fellow who put together these maps, he's excellent. So cool stuff there. Back to the presentation. We will jump to some more maps here shortly because I do love them, but that's enough for that one. One of the primary tools for land protection for a land trust are these conservation easements that I talked about a little bit. A conservation easement is a voluntary legal agreement. Voluntary legal agreement that permanently limits use of the land in order to protect its conservation values. So there's a couple things there. Number one, it's legal. Like I said, it has that federal legislation protecting it. It's permanent. So if I protect that Smith property again with a conservation easement, that conservation easement stays on that property forever. If Smith sells to Jones, doesn't matter. Jones now owns the property, but it's still protected permanently, forever, in perpetuity. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is that this is voluntary, meaning it's not forced upon anyone. It's not the state, coming and claiming eminent domain or something like that. It is either us approaching a landowner or a landowner approaching us and saying, hey, your property is very valuable for reasons X, Y, Z, or them coming to us and saying, I'd like to see this property preserved because I want my grandkids to grow up on this property, this 100 acres, never see it develop. So it's something that there's a really good, it's mutually beneficial, but there's really good dialogue and really good cooperation between the landowner and the land trust, who's ultimately placing the conservation easement onto the property. There you go. It's agreed upon between the landowner and a qualified land trust or government agency, meaning that state, federal, local, counties oftentimes can legally hold these conservation easements. They're qualified to do so. And by qualified, we mean, because these are permanent documents, permanent protections, they're never going to, you need a responsible party who's not going to try to let the land go to waste, who's not going to try to get rid of the easement, which you really can't do very easily, and pave over top of it. So it's often a government agency or a land trust. To be more specific, it's really because we don't own the land. It stays privately owned by the landowner, but what we're buying from them and what we're agreeing upon is we will buy the development rights from you. Think about like water rights or mineral rights or timber rights, things like that can often be sold off to distinct parties. Well, development rights can be sold off as well. So we're buying the development rights from the landowner in these instances. So if they want to do, I don't say anything, but if they want to do most anything on this property, each easement specific, but we are always going to have a say because we have the development rights to the property, and often the logging, mineral, and water rights or anything else associated with it. So they really just own the land at that, and we have all the right to everything else. Not that we're, hard ass is really coming down and cracking on them because we have these rights, but there are certainly restrictions associated with that. It's voluntary. It is tax incentivized for them, so they do get some benefit from it. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that because it confuses me sometimes. Taxes confuse me. So I do know that we can purchase the rights from them, and they either get a lump sum, or they can just donate the value of the development rights, and then they get some kind of tax incentive, tax break for that. For reference, properties in the Lehigh Valley, specifically with crazy land prices and housing prices that are going on in the valley today, if your property is worth $1 million, it would probably cost us $500,000 to buy to buy the development rights from you. So that conservation easement will cost us $500,000, which is why we like it if they donate it. Because if they don't want to donate, then we have to raise those funds, and that's either through a state grant or I mentioned Moore Township before has a great program. They've got some taxes written into their laws that have a nice pot of money that they can put money towards conserving the property as well. Donated or purchased, I'm getting ahead of myself. Permanent protection, I said before, and it limits development. Each one of these is specific. Each one of these is tailored to the property. There's probably a set of 20 to 30 general rules and regulations that they have to follow to make these things black and white. But then there's a lot of gray area associated with these. So again, the conservation easement is the development, we're us buying the rights, but there is a guiding document, usually like 20 or 30 pages, that says what you can and can't do on the property. And, we're tailoring them for specific conservation purposes. But the landowner might say, I have 100 acres. I have a house on it, but I would like to put my son wants to build a house on the property too. How can we work that in there? So then we'll say, all right, well, let's get a lawyer to write this up, and it'll say, okay, the Smith's son has a right to 2 acres of land and a house no bigger than 5,000 square feet, no more than 10,000 square feet of impervious cover with a driveway, certain height restrictions, all kinds of crazy good, crazy bad, however you look at it. All kinds of restrictions and limitations are associated with this property. But it's very specific to the property and what the wishes of the landowner might be today and in the future. You can work in logging in forestry. You can work in forestry into the easements as well. As long as you want to timber your property off, that's fine, but it has to be approved by Wildlands Conservancy or River Land Trust, and it has to be something that's going to be benefiting conservation. So really specific, but really, really good permanent use of resources here. So, yeah, go ahead.
So why would someone do that?
Why would somebody do what?
Why would they donate? I mean, it's almost like, is the land even worth anything anymore because you can't do anything with it?
Well, a lot of times, and the reason I point out it's voluntary, and is I used the example before of like, well, I want this land for my grandkids. a lot of people just have that moral, philosophical want to do some good for the land, some good for the property that was, passed down through generations, whatever it might be, or for that matter, if they want the tax incentives of it. But most people we deal with are very much conservation-driven people and are really just want to see the land protected. Now, they don't want to move off the property. They don't want to see, them lose the farm or the property itself, but they want to be able to protect it permanently so that, they or their kids or their grandkids can't be coerced into selling to somebody who wants to put in, hey, here's $1 million. You mind if I buy this property for housing development? They could do that. But if there's a conservation easement on it, now your kids or grandkids can't do that. So it's typically just something that you want to see the property protected for your family, or you want to see it protected for conservation value or the resource, whatever's on the property. It's strictly voluntary, but we deal with a lot of folks who are just awesome people. Really love the fact that their property is conserved because they see what's happening to the valley and surrounding areas here. Yes.
So in most of those cases, there's residents on the property. So you still can use it as a house and 70 acres, and the person you sell it to can use it as a house and 70 acres, or maybe even some farming. These typically aren't completely pristine, completely in vacant land, right?
Correct. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I would say probably 80-85% of our conservation easements have residences on them. There's only a handful that don't actually have the residents on the property as well.
It still has a wonderful resale value as a house with extra.
Yeah, absolutely. But the resale value is going to be, if it's $1 million property and we buy development rights, you're probably not selling it for $1 million. You're probably selling it for the 500,000 because there's no development rights, logging rights, mineral rights with it. You're probably selling it for what it's now worth because you can't develop the property. But yeah, more often than not, the residences are on these properties.
My grandfather did something similar back in the 1970s when he got rid of the farm. There was a lot of forested land on Hock Mountain in Bucks County that is now state game lands, and I don't honestly know whether he donated it or sold it to the game lands. But I remember in the family, it was my grandfather didn't want to see houses cropping up all over Hock Mountain, which for our family was sort of like Walton's Mountain. It was like it's where we all grew up, and he just didn't want to see that, so it became state game lands, and I don't know what the deal was, but it was important to him that not be developed.
Yeah. That sentiment exactly is what is often described to us, and well, it's not always going to be this beautiful, pristine piece of land. It could be a farm. There's nothing wrong with that. It could be something that they've logged over in the past. It doesn't have to be something beautiful, pristine, but it's just something that is near and dear to a lot of these landowners that they just don't want to see developed for whatever reason. They don't trust their kids or grandkids to do it, so let's do it. Let's do it permanently and do it the right way. I think more often than not, too, the kids and grandkids and whomever else do really appreciate a lot of that stuff because we do have a lot of interaction with these landowners and their families. So, yeah, that sentiment exactly is described perfectly. So if you ever see signs like this out there, this is protected by a conservation easement. Ducks Unlimited, one of those, albeit a hunting organization, does a lot for conservation. And what's that? Land trust. It's protected forever by a local land trust there. So you'll see signs like that. We have blazes on some trees, not all of them. Don't do it too much, but you'll see those periodically. So to get specifically into what Wildlands does as a land trust, I'm going to go into our default presentation slides that we have to use for everything, and sort of a nice opening slide. Wildlands Conservancy, creating lasting connections to nature since 1973. So we're a nonprofit land trust since 1973. Says it right there. I believe it to be true. We are the Lehigh Valley's premier land trust. We have a lot of positive feedback from our partners. I'm not just trying to toot my own horn here in organizations form, but we are very well respected, not only in the Valley, but throughout the state for our efforts. A lot of great staff, a lot of great people, a lot of great volunteers and donors and things like that. Just an awesome organization. And it all started in 1973 with Robert Rodale and some other folks getting together with $20 and starting a trust fund, donating some land up on South Mountain. And we were actually Lehigh Valley Conservancy back then, but transitioned to the Wildlands Conservancy. But goes back to that idea of people just wanting to see things conserved. It could be Teddy Roosevelt, it could be your grandfather, it could be whomever, like some like-minded individuals getting together to start this organization, to start this land trust, and start to work towards protecting land and natural resources in the valley and Lehigh River watershed. So our vision is a Lehigh Valley and Lehigh River watershed that contain natural areas, connected green spaces, healthy waterways, and an enlightened community where people embrace conservation and sustainability. And our mission is to protect and restore critical natural areas and waterways and educate the community to create a legacy of healthy, sustainable environment for future generations, right? So that's the goal. I kind of mentioned it there in the opening slide of like what is conservation and the definitions of conservation. It's protecting these natural resources. It's passing this stuff, these resources on in a sustainable way to future generations. And it starts at the federal level and it comes all the way down here to the old Lehigh Valley and the work that Wildlands does and other land trusts throughout the state. A lot of slides and maps now. Where we work. Let me tell you, why not just show you? So Lehigh Valley yet again, Lehigh and Northampton counties labeled conveniently this time. And then this blue area shaded out here is what is called the Lehigh River watershed. So any drop of rain that falls within these boundaries is going to flow into a stream, tributary, into the ground, wherever it might be, and work its way eventually to the Lehigh River. This is kind of behind the county boundaries there, but down here, this light blue line, the Lehigh River. From its headwater all the way up to Wayne counties, all the way down to where it enters the Delaware River. I kind of mentioned that in the reason I changed the presentation is because the boundaries are kind of arbitrary, right? And because, parts of the Lehigh and Northampton counties aren't technically in the Lehigh River watershed. These flow west into, I'm not even sure where they flow to, but their ones flow directly into the Delaware. So it's a pretty big geography. It's 10 counties, over 1 million acres of land encompassed in the 2 counties plus the watershed. 2,519 miles of stream, which I should mention, back to Pennsylvania being rich in resources. Pennsylvania has 86,000 miles of stream, which is second most in the United States, only to Alaska. So water is very, very big. It's kind of why we're water-centric. We protect land to protect the water, right? To clean the water, to filter the water, to protect the stream directly. But there's lots of stream and lots of land in our working geography. It includes the Pocono Plateau, Appalachian Mountains, and Lehigh Valley / Great Valley, like I mentioned before. The Lehigh River specifically is the largest tributary to the Delaware. But as we know of this region, it is rapidly growing. It's got increased urbanization and a bigger and bigger footprint from that sense. It has such decreasing open space, as you can imagine. But we are fortunate because there are still a lot of really cool, awesome protected lands. Has anybody ever hiked in Jim Thorpe, Tank Hollow? It's a really short hike. I highly recommend maybe like a half mile off of state game land. It takes you this beautiful overlook of the Lehigh River and the Lehigh River Gorge. Really, really nice spot. You probably missed the leaves this year, but it's still a pretty spot. To talk a little bit more about the Lehigh River, it's kind of following it through its geography. The river is such an important part of what we do that it will kind of be more so than the Lehigh Valley will be the focus of the rest of these slides and the presentations. But the watershed, the river itself originates in the Appalachian Plateau, Pocono Plateau rather, up in Wayne County, nice little headwater stream. This is actually a picture taken on the 500-acre Klondike property, which we refer to it as, which we just protected 2-3 years ago and transferred to the Game Commission. So that's now permanently protected right there in the headwaters of the Lehigh. Probably the most important piece of property we've protected in the last few years. The main stem works its way down southwest and meets the Tobyhanna Creek, which, again, if you're familiar with that area, is another large creek up in that area. Basically, have 2 stems of the Lehigh that flow through really heavily wooded areas, good water quality. The Poconos in these counties up in the headwaters, really nice areas for forests. Eventually, it gets down to the 30-mile Lehigh River Gorge. Nice steep gorge. You only have a railroad track and the D&L trail running up through it. Just beautiful, beautiful area in general. Keeps the water nice and cool. You do get a little bit closer to Jim Thorpe up near, what are my towns up there? Nescahoning, maybe. You do start to run into some problems before you leave the gorge, which are 4 tributaries which carry substantial acid mine drainage from past coal mining practices directly into the river. So if these 4 small tributaries dump quite a bit of AMD polluted water in there, but overall, the water quality still remains pretty darn good because it's a big river at this point. I should note, actually, I should back up a little bit. It's not this slide. The Francis C. Walter Dam and Francis C. Walter Reservoir. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers owns a big dam somewhere in this vicinity that regulates flows downstream. So it's a free-flowing stream in the headwaters for I forget how many miles, runs into this reservoir, and then it's a bottom release, meaning the water comes out from the bottom, basically as it enters the Lehigh River Gorge. So from there down, you do run into a couple other small dams, but nothing big like the Francis E. Walter. From the AMD sites, you eventually get down a little farther downstream to the Lehigh Gap, where it flows to the Blue Mountain, Kittatinny Ridge, that's synonymous. That is our separation point. You'll see a lot of graphs and maps here shortly, and you'll see why we use it as a separation point between the upper half and lower half. Enters the Lehigh Valley, the river does, between Lehigh and Northampton counties. Flows through the Lehigh Valley, which is a really big mosaic of urban landscapes, agricultural landscapes, and finally dumps out into the Delaware River at Easton, just south of the Bushkill Creek comes in here, Delaware River here, Lehigh River coming across there. So really unique geography, really nice river nonetheless. I would like to talk about more, so we're going to dive into that quickly. History of Lehigh River watershed, big Native American area used for hunting, trapping, transportation, you name it, fishing. Really good, pristine resources up here to be utilized back in those times. Unfortunately, as we know, again, unfortunately, I'm not here to say this is all bad, but the Lehigh River's primary drivers upon European settlization was industry. Everything from logging to coal. Those are two big ones. I don't think much else going on. But some really bad environmental practices going on back in those days, stripping the hillsides clean, damming up the rivers, extracting the coal and allowing that to run directly into the Lehigh. Really just hard environmentally on the river. The Lehigh was at one point kind of like locally known as the Black River because there was so much coal just floating down or tumbling downstream, pretty much void of life from all the acid mine drainage and things like that.
When I was a kid, you didn't even want to touch the water at the Lehigh River. 1970s.
Yep. So, yeah, basically from the time of European colonizing to the 1960s or 70s, to that point, you didn't want to go anywhere near it. No, and for good reason. It was very heavily polluted from all these industrial practices. You probably had some tanneries, people making leather and things like that along the way, which dumped some harsh chemicals in. All kinds of just really harsh environmental practices. Even down into the valley, as all of settlements happen along waterways, big industries like Bethlehem Steel, all these housing communities, these cities, these towns popping up along the river, getting rid of the trees, getting rid of the wetlands, really just the influx of people and industrialization along the Lehigh made it to a point where you didn't want to touch it. You didn't want to swim in it. You certainly didn't want to drink it. But just a nasty, for lack of a better term, body of water at that point, which is a stark contrast to what we, I think, probably know today, or at least they'll detail today. But moving into the 60s and 70s, when you started to have a lot of these, this big movement, as well as the federal legislation and the Clean Water Act towards cleaning up our rivers and streams in the United States, right? That's its primary purpose, is to start to clean these up and to protect them. So you set some water quality standards for what can be dumped into the river. You assess the water quality. You make sure you permit people to make sure they're not dumping things into the water they should be, and really and enforce all that stuff. And really at this point too, you started to see, aside from people wanting to protect and manage our water resources, specifically as it relates to the Lehigh, you started to see a lot of the industries kind of phase out. Logging wasn't going to be a thing anymore. Coal was slowly starting to be pushed out, especially it's a little farther east out of the watershed. I'm sorry, a little farther west out of the watershed where coal was still king, but not so much in the watershed anymore. So you didn't have these big pollutants. Things were kind of naturally coming back on their own, but really the whole effort was spearheaded by some of this federal legislation. Again, the importance of why I even talked about it in the beginning was to say that we're not operating disconnected. The Lehigh is what it is today, probably because of things like the Water Act. So it's all connected from every level. And basically since the 70s, what are we in the 50 years now, the Lehigh has made a huge, huge, huge comeback. There are, aside from those 4 acid mine drainage streams, I'll talk about some more of the pollution, but on the whole, the Lehigh River is very good water quality. It's excellent water quality in the headwaters. It's really not to the valley that starts to change. But even down here in the valley, I mean, you could swim in it. I probably wouldn't recommend drinking it. You probably could get away with it, but I'm not going to advocate for that. But really just a nice clean body of water now. Great for fishing, great for kayaking, great for just recreation in general. So from that time back when you couldn't go into it to where we are today is nothing short of a miracle in my mind. But really, I think the reason is because of the idea of conservation and the efforts from a legislative perspective to a land protection perspective. It's really thwarted a lot of. It's really pushed along this progress and probably faster than what would normally happen because of all this conservation. But as we know, doesn't mean all is well and good. We've had past industrial practices. We've cleaned things up. But now we're facing some new threats here, specifically in the Lehigh Valley, and to a lesser extent, but nonetheless an extent in the Poconos, of urbanization, rapid urbanization, expansive housing developments that increase impervious cover, which I'll just touch upon now. Really is really bad for water quality without going too much into it. And then everybody's favorite, I'm sure, warehouses. This is from somewhere in the valley. Although I don't know if those were solar panels or not, which kind of made me happy. But yeah, just increasing the footprint of urbanization, these big warehouses, the big areas of impervious cover, and the negative effects that might have on a stream, warming the temperature, less groundwater infiltration, more direct pollution, more road salts. You name it, it's going to have an effect on the water quality that is getting into the Lehigh River, either directly into it, like as it's flowing off a parking lot, or flowing to these minor tributaries or to a water retention pond, which don't really do a whole lot. This pollution from urbanization is having and is going to continue to have an impact, especially if we don't think more critically about where we're putting these things. How we plan our zoning in particular is something that could be certainly improved in these areas. Along those lines, a lot of population growth in the bear with me here. River Watershed outlined in black here, and then all these different colors lines are separating the municipal boundaries, and then the colors are associated with populations and population growth. So your red and orange areas have bigger populations, more population growth. Your yellows and greens have smaller populations per no, it's not per capita, per area. It's just general population. And then your green areas, obviously more forested, not a whole lot of people. But the main takeaway from this is that the populations in the regions of the Lehigh Valley and Lehigh River watershed are growing or have grown pretty rapidly. And not to go too much in this graph, but that's kind of what you're seeing here. You're seeing an influx. This is Bucks County population increasing quite significantly. This is projected Lehigh Valley populations here in the greens and blues, all trending upward. And that only takes us to 2040. The statistic for Lehigh Valley is we're around 650,000 people today. By 2040, there's estimates that will be around 800,000 people. Not too, 19 years away. So we are growing quickly, and that's going to have an impact on not only our land, our farms, but to keep it water focused here for a second is certainly on the streams and whatnot too. So increasing populations, and we'll talk about that graphic. I don't know too much about that. We are lucky that there are a lot of protected lands in the Lehigh River watershed already. Adding up those numbers quickly on the bottom, we're talking over 230,000 acres of about 1 million acres, so almost a quarter of it is protected. Most of that land protection, color coordinated up here. You've got game lands, you've got land trust protected, you've got state parks, state forests are somewhere around here somewhere too. But lots of protected land in the northern part of the Lehigh River watershed, mostly agriculture easements and parks, conservation easements down here in the southern half, in the Lehigh Valley specifically. And I do apologize because I did steal some of these slides from a previous show. Some of the graphs are going to show just the Lehigh River watershed. Some of them are going to show the Lehigh River watershed plus the Lehigh Valley. So I'll try to just point it out so you're not getting too confused. But the purpose nonetheless remains on this one, not to protect the land. If we look at land cover without diving into details, just based on color, green, dark green is forest, light green is agriculture, different shades of pinks and reds are urbanization, housing developments, things like that. Browns are, light greens and browns are farm fields. So here's a dividing line. I mentioned when the Lehigh River flows through the Kittatinny Ridge and the Blue Mountain, very, very distinct differences. We've got this northern half, which is largely forested, over 62%, I think that says, yep, is forested at that point. Whereas in the southern half, you're only looking at 23% is forested. And you start to see much more farm fields, urbanization, compared to these tiny little fractions up here that are actually farm field urbanization. It's critical to separate these out, right? Because your efforts are going to be different in these distinct regions. What we do in the Lehigh Valley is probably going to be different up here in the Poconos because of these stark differences in populations, land cover type, growth, things like that are going on. From a stream quality perspective, Upper Lehigh here, streams are designated in 5 categories. Got exceptional value streams, which are highest water quality, really great chemical parameters, water temperature, minimal pollutants. Step below that's high quality. Step below that's cold water fishery, and then yada yada after that. But just know that 19% of the streams in the Lehigh River watershed on the upper half are exceptional value streams, including the main tributary to the Lehigh and all of its, the Lehigh River and all of its main tributaries are all exceptional value, really, really good water quality up there. 50% are high quality, so just a step below that. And then you don't even have any, still looking at this graph, but you don't have any red, which is warm water fisheries. Those are your lowest quality water. You don't have any of that in the Upper Lehigh. All good cold stuff, cold, clean water. As you get into the Lehigh River watershed, you have Lehigh Valley and Lower Lehigh River watershed. You have exactly 0% exceptional value streams. So all that urbanization, all those farm fields do have an impact on the water quality. You do have 38% high quality, which stems from the fact that we have some mountains and protected lands. And probably more importantly, we have a lot of limestone. Those are those springs that I was talking about, the Little Lehigh, the Bushkill, and the Monocacy. We have really high quality water that's being pumped out of the ground. So that at least saves Lehigh Valley a little bit. But you kind of get most of it in this middle category of water quality, which is cold water fishery. So very distinct differences between these two regions. Streams can also be impaired, and impaired can mean there's some kind of pollutant affecting some quality of the water. For just know it's impaired, right? In the Upper Lehigh, you're only talking 6% of the Upper Lehigh River watershed is impaired. Most of those are from those acid mine streams. One of those is from mercury. I have no clue where that comes from. But 96% are unimpaired, meaning again, clean water, cold water, versus the Lehigh Valley, where only is that about 40% are considered unimpaired. The remaining 60% are impaired by some kind of pollutant. And again, that can be in the Lehigh Valley specifically, most of them, I do talk about it a little bit on this one. Most of them are things like agriculture and erosion so it's heavy waters running directly off a farmer's field into the streams. But it's also things like habitat modifications, urban runoff. Those are the two big ones. So channelizing a stream, taking away the trees and the buffer along the stream, running it through concrete, whatever it might be. But it's all associated with pretty much every impaired stream in the Lehigh Valley is associated with urbanization and poor farming practices. And again, that all comes down to how the land is used. When the upper section is, so much green open space, 80% natural cover, you're going to have these good, cold, clean streams. When it's urbanized, when it's developed, when there's warehouses and roads and poor farming practices, you're going to have impaired streams. And that's why this conservation work, that's why we separate our conservation work out between these areas. Just to kind of touch quickly and then move on from this is the importance of some of this habitat. 80% of the Upper Lehigh is natural habitat, connected. And when we have great habitat, we have lots of biodiversity, meaning lots of species, lots of plants, lots of insects, lots of wildlife and birds when things are connected. So that upper Lehigh area has a lot of connectivity, consequently has a lot more biodiversity, which really is one of the big goals of conservation in general. Almost 500,000 acres of forest. And again, you can see the distinct differences. Big, don't look too much in the grass, just know that big areas of connected land up here, almost no big core tracts of land down there. You could have 10, what's missing one? There's 18,000 acres of contiguous protected land at one point, which is a huge tract of land. You don't have anything close to that anywhere down in the Lehigh Valley. And the more big protected areas of land you can have, the more biodiversity you're going to have, the better habitat, more species sustained, different species sustained. And out, down here in the Lehigh Valley, you tend to have more generalist species. Your fox and your deer and your things that can live amongst people. Whereas things like maybe those birds. Anybody? I want to say it's a scarlet tanager, but I don't want to get it wrong. Okay. Whereas things like scarlet tanager require very specific habitats, big habitats, lots of protected land. They don't like the urbanization. So you get a lot of these in cities. You don't get a lot of these in cities. You still get a lot of these in forested land, but they're adaptable, unlike some of these other species. So the importance of all this land cover stuff. So that's where we work. That's kind of why we work there. We do like to tease apart these different areas because we do different things in the northern half of the watershed as we do in the Lehigh Valley. But on the whole, our primary goal is, again, connecting people and nature, increasing protections for our natural resources. I'm going to start with our education program, which admittedly I do not know a whole lot about. We have separate silos, and I don't get over to their world, especially now we're mostly working from home, and especially that I'm out in the field most of my time. So I do apologize. They are very good at what they do, and most people actually know us for education, but I am just not as pervy to what they do as I should be.
We're doing it right now.
There you go. That's right. There you go. Thank you. So the primary goal is to provide nature-based education through school programs, camps, and community programs. Every single year, they educate through one of their programs about 15,000 students. I think that took a hit during the pandemic. I'm sure it did, but those were our historic numbers at least, and it's getting back to that. And they also lead every year hundreds, if not thousands of people, honestly, on local education and recreation programs. So that can be like myself leading a hike at one of our nature preserves versus an actual educator going, to a school or having the school come to us for a program. Again, all nature focused at that point. They are very good at their jobs. They have an award-winning environmental education program. They got state and national recognition for a program called Wild About Learning. It's school-age students. I don't know enough about it other than apparently it's a big deal. So I'll give them credit for that. They also have a bike and boat program that our education staff run, which is a more community level program, although some schools do partake, and Brian used to help volunteer for. You bike down the D&L trail. You boat down the D&L trail in a kayak or canoe, boat down the Lehigh River in a kayak or canoe, and you bike up the D&L trail. There we go. We typically run that out of Sand Island Park in Bethlehem. There's a couple other areas as well. They also host the Lehigh River Sojourn, which is a 3-day kayaking and canoeing event down the Lehigh. And they offer a lot of internship and volunteer programs. And when I say internship, we're typically focusing on college-age students who are in education or conservation and want to get some experience teaching. So they'll come in the lead, our summer camp programs, things like that. So every year, I think our education staff goes from like 10 people to 25 people every summer, because we have so many students coming for our summer camps that we have all these part-time, we call naturalists, these interns, these college-age students getting credit, coming and working at these programs. It's a really great experience for them. I've heard positive things, but I heard that they often find themselves, being able to find jobs and whatnot because of the experience they had at Wildlands. And here's some happy, educated students that just to show that they do such a great work. Again, I do apologize for not knowing more about our education program, but I'm telling you, you go to our office preserve in the summertime, which is the Dorothy Ryder Pool Wildlife Sanctuary in Emmaus, and there are just like hundreds of kids each day running around. We've got animals. We've got we keep a bunch of animals for education purposes. So animals are constantly out with these kids being taught some kind of lesson. They're tubing down the stream, learning about water quality. There's so much that goes on with their education department that they do deserve more justice than what I'm giving to them. But that is certainly our claim to fame at Wildlands. Of course, people know us for here. Now, more into what I do and can speak more highly of, not more highly, more thoroughly about, with one exception. Our conservation department is really broken up into 4 sections from there. We've got a trails and greenways staff member, singular. We've got a land protection department, a property stewardship department, and an ecological restoration department. So I'm going to go through and talk a bit more about those specifically, because I think this really starts to hit home with what we do in the Lehigh Valley and the watershed here. This is the one I can't speak too much about, is our trails and greenways work. It's kind of my one colleague, Chris Stroller, he just took this and ran with it, even though he wasn't really supposed to, but he's done a great job. So his main goal, and that department's main goal, is to develop local and regional trails, greenways, and water trails. Specifically, we could look at the D&L Trail, which is 165 miles from Wilkes-Barre down to Bristol, Pennsylvania, which is near Philly. Wildlands, along with the D&L Trail, I can't not give them credit as well. There's a nonprofit specifically devoted to the D&L Trail, but I would argue that we've had probably protected just as much land, secured just as many trail easements, and built just as many miles of trail as they have through our efforts here. So it's a great partnership that we've really helped to work on. I'm sure, has everybody ever walked on that trail before, biked it? It's really a popular, awesome trail. Nice, easy going too. But there's also smaller trails that we've helped establish, like the Ironton Rail Trail, which is a Parkland High School area. Where is the Ironton Rail Trail? Whitehall, thank you. Whitehall Copley area. The Jordan Creek Greenway, which is Parkland High School area, is one that we're currently developing, which will connect Allentown to Trexler Nature Preserve. It's probably about halfway there and moving forward about as quickly as a project can move forward. In general, conservation work in the Lehigh Valley is tough because you're working with a lot of landowners, a lot of properties, a lot of parcels. The Jordan Creek Greenway, I'm thinking here, it has to share sections of road because you're in a tight corridor near Trexler where you can't just go through somebody's property. The railroad doesn't really exist anymore. So it's true on the Jordan Creek Greenway. It's true on all these projects. It's tough going to work in the Lehigh Valley. That's one of them in particular. But then there's also things like the Lehigh River Water Trail, which we didn't build, but it's now officially state designated water trail from the Francis E. Walter Dam down 72 miles to the mouth of the Lehigh River. And we helped develop some access points, boat launches, signage, all kinds of things, maps, all kinds of things to help folks who want to go kayaking and do whatnot navigate the Lehigh River. Website resources, mapping resources. And not necessarily lastly, but one of the other big things we do, there is a cooperative effort between the D&L Trail, the Wildlands Conservancy, local rail trail groups, local municipalities, to kind of put all these efforts together into one. So what we end up seeing is, okay, we build D&L Trail through Whitehall Township, South Whitehall Township. I'm sorry, it's North Whitehall Township, and those municipalities are responsible for their sections, and they tend to have different signage. They tend to not keep up with things in the same capacity. So because there's so much, these trails really are owned by so many distinct entities. There's been this effort to put together what is called the Link, and it is a big effort to group all of these trails together in the Lehigh Valley into what is referred to as the Link Trail Network. So each trail will kind of maintain a separate identity. There'll still be the Ironton Rail Trail, there'll still be D&L Trail, there'll still be Jordan Creek Greenway, but now we're all going to have consistent signage, MOUs, moratoriums of understanding on how to manage the trail, what they should look like, how often you should keep up with it, to try to get all these efforts on the trails and greenways concerted so that we can kind of keep up with this stuff in a more effective manner. So a lot going on in the Lehigh Valley. I wish I had a better map of the trail network in the Lehigh Valley, but there are quite a few trails. The D&L kind of acts as the spine, if you will, and the light trails branch off from there. More conservation work. What else do we do? The big thing, our big department as a land trust, is our land preservation department. Their job is to protect land. And again, that's going to be done through fee simple ownership, which is we own the land, conservation easements, which we talked about, and then transfers and facilitations. And I call those out separately. A transfer would be we bought the property, transferred it to somebody else. A facilitation would be we help simply facilitate an agreement between a landowner and, say, the Pennsylvania Game Commission. So those kind of got lumped together, but they are separate. To date, Wildlands Conservancy specifically has helped protect over 55,000 acres of land throughout the Lehigh Valley and Lehigh River watershed. We own 3,000 acres. We have eased about 10,000 acres. We have conservation easement on them. And we've transferred or facilitated another 42,000 acres in this area. Oh, yeah, back to the internet. Oops. Just like maps, as I mentioned, and I got some cool interactive ones. So just to kind of show you guys the footprint that Wildlands has had on this region. I have a couple series of maps here, but we'll start with this one, maybe. There we go. Okay, to zoom in just a little bit. Slow. There we are. The black outline here. Sorry, it's interactive. So black outline is the watershed. Valley's down in here. You can see our footprint is extended, and all these points represent different projects that we've had association with. Anything that's green, these green little points are properties we still own. Purple are conservation easements, and blue are properties that we transferred or facilitated. So our footprint is bigger than the Lehigh River and Lehigh River watershed and Lehigh Valley. It's much bigger than that. It incorporates quite a bit of eastern Pennsylvania. It's got a property up in Bradford County. It's got one down in Carlisle. No clue why. But really, I think back in the 70s and whatnot, we just kind of focused on where can we get our hands in the pot here to help sustain our organization. What projects we help on to build partnerships. What we do to just help be good stewards, because this is an awesome project. So historically, our efforts have really taken us just throughout eastern Pennsylvania. It really hasn't been until probably the last 10, 15, 20 years where we've really started to focus and narrow our efforts into the geography that I was referencing before. Still a couple exceptions to that, but not a whole lot. So most of the efforts here, now it's kind of transitioned over to pink. Anything that's outlined in pink is something that we've had a hand in. So this is actually the Blue Mountain. It's where most of our conservation efforts have happened, where we've transferred and facilitated, a 200-acre parcel here that went to the Pennsylvania Game Commission. This pinkish one here is about 400 acres. That went to the Lehigh Gap Nature Center. So we had our hands in it, we facilitated it, but now it's in the hands of another organization, as opposed to, say, our conservation easements or the property that we own. We still manage those. But the reason that's very popular amongst land trusts to transfer and facilitate these land deals, these land protection deals, is because 55,000 acres of land is a lot to own. It's a lot to maintain. It's a lot to steward. And land trusts simply don't have the resources able to do this. So if you remember back to that number I threw out before, that 56 million acres of land have been protected by land trusts. The reason to hold a lot of that is because it's just so hard to hold all that. So we give them to organizations like the Game Commission, like U.S. Fish and Wildlife owns some property out in eastern Northampton County and Monroe County. We can't steward those lands, but they can. So it's a matter of just having the local connection, working with those landowners, finding a way to make a deal happen, raising the funds, and then, hey, DCNR, here's 100 acres to go to your state forest land, just to make this all come together here full swing. A lot of work, a lot of time and effort goes into these things. So, all these points represent, I couldn't even tell you how many hours, lots and lots of hours. Once we protect a piece of land, this is my department now as preserve manager at Wildlands. I work in the property stewardship department. And once we protect a piece of land, it's our job to steward it. Aside from the lands we transfer and facilitated, we do own 14 nature preserves, that's 3,000 acres. And, there's quite a bit of diversity to these preserves. It could be anything from a fully built out preserve like our Dorothy Ryder Pool Wildlife Sanctuary, where we have trails. This is our boardwalk trail. We've got office buildings, we've got pavilions, we've got bathrooms, nice big parking lot, everything you could possibly want in this preserve. It could be our 1,400-acre Thomas Darling Preserve, where we have a parking lot, and about 250 acres of habitat management that we're doing for golden wing warblers. This is phase 1 to the left and phase 2 to the right, where we did some prescribed fires, some timber harvesting to create habitat for an endangered species of neotropical bird known as the golden wing warbler, which needs young forest, brushy habitat. It doesn't need big swaths of land, so we do habitat management. So we go from recreation purposes, we go to habitat purposes, and then we've got a preserve or preserves like this one here, which is Freeman's Island, which is an island in the middle of the Lehigh River. I have never stepped foot on, nor has next to anybody. So we have it as nature preserve, but there's really no plan or anything for that property other than make sure it exists there every year, and nobody's doing anything. But we do tend to focus on these 14 nature preserves. We do tend to focus on public access from a parking perspective and facilities perspective, to signage, to trailblazes, getting people on the trails through recreation, to introducing people to our habitat management and our natural resource management, and to a lesser extent, although these are often very important, like our cultural and local resource management and things like that. I like to think of South Mountain Preserve, for example, has a lot of old iron ore industry on it, and you can still see signs of like those pit mines and things like that. So we just like to have some kind of educational signage associated with those different historical and cultural resources as well. So when we manage these 3,000 acres in these 14 nature preserves, we're managing for some or all of these things. Again, Freeman's Island here is never going to have this, but maybe our Black River Sanctuary, our newest property, doesn't have anything today, but it will have public access, it will have trails, we'll have habitat management projects going on it. So it's really just driven by the property itself, where it's located, and what we can actually do with the property. 3,000 acres. Total, we have 37 trails on these 14 preserves, 26 miles of trail. You can hike on there, you can bike on there, you can walk around. Some of them are ADA compliant. Some of them are very, very hard and difficult, going up South Mountain. Some of them are kind of through wetlands and streams up in the Poconos. So it really all depends, but really a diversity of trails take you throughout these preserves and give you a lot of opportunities. If it's stream access, you can hunt on some of our properties. It's just really open to the public. Even Freeman's Island, which has nothing on it, is technically open to the public. So you can go and do whatever you want, explore, be careful, stay safe, kind of thing. But really quite a diversity there. We have 10 valley preserves in the Lehigh Valley, mostly along South Mountain, south of Allentown and Easton, if you folks are familiar. A couple outside of Macungie, one kind of outside of Bethlehem now. And then we have 4 in the Poconos, more 3. One's kind of not the Poconos, but it's close. And those are certainly our bigger ones. So the Lehigh Valley might have 10, but I think it only accounts for something like maybe 600 acres, maybe 700. And then the 4 in the Poconos, 2 in particular, account for 3,000 alone. So bigger land in the Poconos, bigger preserves, less public access because we simply haven't built out the infrastructure. Lehigh Valley, more people, smaller tracts of land, smaller preserves, but they've all got nice trails and things like that on them. They provide a lot of opportunity. Just for reference, little story map I put together. These are locations of all our preserves, information about them. The rig up here in the Poconos, that's a Pocono one technically, and the rest down here in the valley, south of Allentown. If you want to learn more, you can click on the tabs. They'll take you in. This is our 400-acre South Mountain Preserve. 10 trails, I think close to 10 miles of trail till it's said and done. Some nice parking areas, things like that. So you could click on these different tabs and learn a little bit more about them. There's our office preserve and all the facilities you can see around the entranceway. Finally, for property stewardship, we hold 97 conservation easements. Kind of saw on that map, some of these extend beyond our typical working area. It accounts for about 10,000 acres of land that is protected through these conservation easements that I talked about. While typically we don't do a whole lot with them once they're protected because we can't, it's up to the landowner if they want to manage their property a little bit more. It's still a voluntary thing. We do receive some federal funding for habitat management projects, specifically on our easements that are in the Delaware River, directly in the Delaware River watershed. So we can go and do a lot of that logging and prescribe fires on some of these properties, as long as the landowner is okay with it and we have funding to do with it. We talk them through that process. They might say they're, for example, they might say they're big turkey hunters. We say, hey, well, we could create some young forests for you. We have funding to do that, and we'll help you create that on your 500-acre property. So it works out well for us because we're doing good habitat work, but it also benefits the landowners in these instances. I'd say there's like, out of these 97, there's probably only 5 or 6 that we do work on, but they're bigger properties. Permanently protected, we all know this after my spiel on conservation easements, but we do have problems with them. If we're not able to manage them, a lot of things like invasive species move into the area. A lot of the native trees and species die as a result, or things like ash trees. If you guys have ash in your property or oaks, they've been dying off. So we do see a lot of problems. And probably our biggest problem in an argument against conservation easements on a whole would be that we're getting into the time frame where we're getting into second or even third landowners. So you're not having the original landowner who wanted that property protected. You're having somebody who doesn't know what a conservation easement is. Their title guy or realtor never told them what it is. Now they come onto the property and they say, well, it's my land. Why can't I do what I want? Well, you can't because there's a conservation easement on it. So for every property we have, that's this, this is our Litzenberger conservation easement up in Pike County. It's about 1,500 acres, beautiful, pristine streams and wetlands, beavers swimming around here. For every one of those that we have one like this, which is actually a really tiny easement along a little wetland in a golf course up in Monroe County, maybe, where the fella went through and cut down here's your wetland over here, cut down all the native vegetation, replanted with landscaping type vegetation, built a shed and stores all his equipment there. So even though it's an easement, he went ahead and did this without knowing. We showed up there one year. Hey, sir, you can't be doing these things. Well, why not? And he didn't know. He was the second landowner to this property, had no clue this conservation even existed, and went through and completely changed the natural landscaping of that property. Now, that's something we work through with them. We don't like to push people, but legally we have an obligation to make sure that comes back to a native sense. So he has to move his shed. He's got to move all these things. He's got to get rid of the invasive species he planted here. And he has to revegetate it. All at cost to him, unfortunately, but that's kind of where it stands. So we've got lots of really nice easements, a few not so nice, but on a whole, done a really good job of protecting some nice pieces of property. We'll skip that web map. It's just a map showing all of our easements, but again, you kind of saw in the last picture, it extends all over the Lehigh Valley and Lehigh River watershed and beyond. Finally, the last department in conservation is our ecological restoration department. They are very water focused, as opposed to our land department, which is land focused. They are very water focused, and their efforts are primarily based here in the Lehigh Valley at this point, although that is changing. Their big thing is going to be state-funded projects in which they restore riparian buffers. So just quickly again, riparian buffers are the natural vegetation that occurs along a stream. It's their job to restore these buffers along the stream. And the reason they focus on the Lehigh Valley is because a lot of streams in the Lehigh Valley don't have buffers anymore. We'll talk just a little bit more about those. But we're actually the leaders in the state in miles of stream restored through our riparian buffer restoration. But they also do in-stream restoration work. So not just on the outskirts of streams, but they'll actually go into the streams and work on some habitat things there. They will remove dams, and they will do some water quality monitoring in a lot of these streams as well. A lot going on here. This is an infographic I stole on why riparian buffers are important. Riparian buffers take water that flows off your house, your parking lot, your impervious cover, your warehouse, your road, and they filter it. Any kind of vegetation along the stream that before it reaches the stream, that water will be filtered out by the root systems of the riparian buffer. It'll use nutrients, which are excessive amounts of nutrients are bad for water quality. It will remove salts. It'll slow the movement of sediments. It will hold the stream bank in place. It will reduce temperature, water temperature. It will provide habitat. All these great things are being done by the vegetation along streams, and we don't even have to ask them to do it. They just do it for us. So it's a really, really good, effective, cheap way to protect water quality is to just plant these riparian buffers or maintain these riparian buffers, especially as areas continue to build out, like the Lehigh Valley is doing. If I want to go through detail more on work, I'll just show you some pretty pictures of what happens when they do work. You take a stream that looks like this, a stream bank's washing away, no vegetation along the side. You restore it, and all of a sudden you've got some nice green vegetation growing along the stream. Same thing here. Ugly, dead vegetation, narrow stream channel, plants of vegetation. You put a little educational signage along it so people who are walking here know where this is happening. I guess I should probably mention that a lot of this work is happening at a park level. So community parks, municipal partners will reach out to us and say, like, hey, we've got this park. This is Lewis. This is Northampton County Park over in Allen Township, before and after. And they said, hey, we want to restore this stream. What can we do? Well, we'll provide some state funding for you guys. We'll get the plants. We'll get some volunteers. We'll do this work. And we'll restore the stream channel for you and really help the conservation value of the stream, of the park, and just of the general landscape around the area. Looks a lot nicer when it's said and done, too. The restoration work takes creeks like this, which have nice shopping carts in it, no vegetation along the stream, rip wrap along the side, which is not a good environmental practice, and turn it into something that looks more like this. You've got nice vegetation, nice meandering stream. The buffers actually do help change the stream channel to more natural flow as well, and it's really good for everything, insects, fish, you name it. And you kind of leave this area between what's mowed in the park. This is somewhere in Allentown, Cedar Park maybe. What's mowed, what's not mowed, and what's consequently restored as a result. So taking things that are kind of ugly and kind of degraded, making them look awfully pretty, in my opinion. And it's not just limited to streams, although they do focus on streams. I kind of mentioned earlier in the presentation, meadows and no-mow areas. Here's an example from 2 years ago, a park in Bethlehem Township, where they had a lot of mowed lawn. And my coworker Kate started planting it with wildflowers, and they installed some benches along the wildflower trails. You get these beautiful wildflower meadows in areas that are no longer mowed. People can walk around and see it. You can relax or see more birds. It's just really, really awesome work. If it's on a stream or if it's in a park, really trying to bring these protected parklands up to par with what it could be good conservation. Bring these streams away from a degraded state, especially here in the Lehigh Valley, whether it's agriculture or urbanization based. And they've done a lot of really, really good work, and actually have started to dabble with private landowners who want to see their streams restored. They have been contacting us more and more about this now. So it's really good stuff. Restoration also dabbles in dam removal. I'm not going to argue about removing dams on this one. Dams need to be removed, no questions asked. You take some streams that look like this and you make them look like that, like something natural that should be there. Dams are horrible for water quality. They're horrible for fish migrations, insect migrations. So you're really just, again, taking out this dam and removing it changing it back to what it should be in its more natural state. Often these dam removal projects are also associated with in-stream habitat work, as well as riparian buffer plantings when we do remove a dam. And the reason I'm not going to argue that is because we get a lot of flack, especially from the fisherman community, the angler community, that they just don't like when we remove dams. And I don't get it, but that's for another day. Best thing about our ecological restoration department is these projects all require volunteers. Look at all these happy volunteers helping us plant trees and restore streams. So they do a really good job of bringing together not only the municipalities who want this work done, or the private landowners, but getting different communities involved and helping to plant and restore these things, because it's a 2-person department and they've got more projects than they can shake a stick at. So these volunteers really, really come in handy. Before I move on, any quick questions about the work we do? I could go on for days about what we do, but I know it's already been a pretty long presentation. Sorry about that. Didn't think it was this long. Last 2 slides anyway. Challenges. This is our biggest thing. I could talk about this for a couple more days. Funding is always going to be the biggest problem for land trusts, in particular wildland. In particular, land trusts and wildlands is no. We're right on par with this. We're a nonprofit. We've got funding shifts from a federal, state, and local level. lot of these large price tags on these it might cost us $10,000 to restore a stream. It might cost us $1 million to buy a piece of property or a conservation easement. So there's a lot of price tags, and donations tend to shift as well. You also need willing partners and landowners for land protection and restoration, and people to work with. Easements are always a challenge. We kind of mentioned that. We're always limited in staff, time, resources, fun things like that. Public perception could be problematic. I mentioned dam removals. People don't like when we remove dams sometimes, so we've often fighting public perception on these things. And probably two of the bigger ones are playing catch up, if you will. So sometimes, like here in the Lehigh Valley, we realize, oh shoot, this land is developing faster than we can protect it, or these streams are being degraded faster than we can restore them. So oftentimes we kind of see the problems, but we don't have funding. Our partners aren't involved. It only becomes a big deal when somebody else realizes it's a big deal and says, oh shoot, we need to start doing this, guys. Hey, Wildlands, how can you help us out? So it gets to be very difficult. And I think this problem from a public willingness and understanding perspective is, this isn't a local issue. This is an international issue. Is how do we get people to care more about conservation and convince them that this is important work? You have people who still don't believe in global warming. They can't be convinced of these things, no matter how much you tell them. So it's a matter of education. It's a matter of getting them involved. It's a matter of trying to find ways to convince folks that this conservation work from a local level to a state level to a federal level is just really, really important stuff. And it's something that benefits us all. And that I think between the public willingness and the funding, I think that would be our and you can argue that funding is driven by public willingness too. You're always going to be struggling with that. And hopefully that changes for better soon. What can you do? Hey, here we go. Get involved. It's as simple as that. Our big things, I mentioned our riparian buffer plantings. I deal with volunteers occasionally as well. That's probably the biggest thing that folks in the community can do is to get involved and volunteer, donate, and advocate on our behalf, on the environment's behalf, on conservation's behalf, whatever it might be. Is we need people to help us do the work. We need people advocating and educating for the stuff out there, promoting the work. And ultimately, we need some kind of funding to do it all. So those three things are probably the most important things to help get involved with Wildlands Conservancy, with your local stream coalition, with your environmental action committee, going to your township zoning meetings and saying, hey, what's up with the zoning? Why are we putting warehouse next to this high quality stream and wetland? Anything like that, just to get out and get more involved and make people more aware of these issues. Because I truly think awareness would go a long way on a lot of this stuff. So with that, I do apologize for the length. It went longer than I anticipated. But are there any questions?
I know you were quite thorough, so most of the questions that I had coming into this, you've already pretty much answered. But if anybody has any other questions, just make sure we bring over the mic to you.
It was a fascinating presentation, and put some order to something which I have never been able to understand. Probably more order than there is, actually. It really was great. I think it would be worth like a half a day to spend for us on it, or to break it into two sections so that people who are interested can get a better idea of where they might be able to fit themselves in or something. I liked it. It just kind of went on long for us. But it's not because it wasn't interesting, and not. I had this timed out for an hour, but I see now we're at an hour and 22 minutes. No, it was very interesting, though. I appreciated it.
And I think we're going to touch on the subject again because we talked with Michael about the volunteer opportunities, and I'm sure that LVH is going to get involved in this in the future. So we will definitely be touching on these subjects again in our other meetings. Brian?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk at length at lunch and all, but I wonder if you could just give a very brief gut feel. What is the strength of conservation in the area for the future? Do you feel like we're in a good place?
Shoot. I will say that with all this development and all these folks coming into the area, I think there's a really, really good opportunity, although in particular, I don't think Wildlands has done a good job of this, but a really good opportunity to leverage some of these new folks, some of this new money coming into the area. People still need a place to live. I'm not going to say don't come here, but I think you could say, hey, how nice would it be to live in an area that has boat launches and clean streams and hiking trails? So we haven't quite, in Lehigh Valley, I don't think we've quite gotten to a point where we've been able to leverage all of this new stuff into funding and into partnerships and into the things that really drive the conservation. But there's a good footing now, a really good core group of volunteers and donors and whatnot. I just think it needs to expand more. It needs to be more awareness and education. I mentioned that Wildlands' MO is people. Oh, Wildlands! I was at your summer camp. I'm like, well, that's not all we do. That's a small component of it. And getting that word out there that there's more to conservation in the Lehigh Valley than just coming to a summer camp. There's land protection. There's all these good things that I mentioned. I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet. And I hope in the future we can, again, leverage is the word I like to use. Leverage a lot of what's happening here. And people, and for that matter, people seeing all this development in warehouses are kind of getting on board and saying, protect this stuff, right? And we're saying we can't. We need help. Help us out. So it's hard to do, but it's hard to do that because this stuff does have large price tags. But that goes along with it.
And talking to municipal governments, I guess, is important too, right? Because they can do, with the influx of people into the area, those people could be passionate, would be willing to vote for contributions from the municipal government towards groups like yours, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have quite a few good partnerships with municipalities, specifically focused on the riparian buffer restoration work, which they use because there are now these stormwater requirements where they have to manage stormwater, and one of the way they can do that is put in riparian buffers. And the more people you have, the more riparian buffers you need. So, I guess the point I'm saying is that municipalities are coming to us more and more because they have to, but I think their citizens are starting to push that more and more.
So go to that township meeting.
Yeah, the relationships are there with all these municipalities, folks. It's just a matter of they need some more of their citizens to be concerned about things like this. So it's there, just a matter of awareness and pushing it.
I had no idea how expensive the organization is. I thought you were just down on Riverbend Road.
Exactly. Exactly.
I knew.
Yeah, that's I do apologize for like that's why I like to detail even the work we do. I rush through it pretty quickly, but because there is so much more to wildlands, and there is so much more to how we're able to do what we do is because there are local, state, and federal folks helping us out along the way, partners, and volunteers. So it's a great thing. Yep.
Yeah, round of applause, please.